Hi, everyone, and welcome to another edition of UBS Road to the Election, an Election Watch series. Today, we're talking all things energy on the campaign trail with my guest, CIO's Jay Dobson. Jay, good to have you here.
Hey, thanks, Anthony. Great to be here.
This is certainly probably a hotly discussed subject, especially when it comes to this particular campaign, which will likely be President Trump versus President Biden. Energy, I'm imagining, is going to be part of their debates. It's going to be part of what they're talking about on the campaign trail. So clearly, there was a reason why we said, Jay, we need you to sit here and tell us what's going on with energy and policy and legislation. So we're going to get into all of that. But I wanted to sort of say first, with the U.S. now, it's the largest oil producer and largest exporter of natural gas. That's a fact. So what happens now, especially when we're looking at these two candidates hitting the trail?
Yeah, it's a great question because, again, you're talking candidates. I think there's going to be a lot of dialogue and debate between now and the election, and then, of course, what happens after the election. And both of these guys have served in office, so we have a bit of a sort of idea of what their policies were, at least, and how they may evolve. But really, I think the differences between the candidates are going to be primarily around regulation and, to a smaller degree, uncertainty. Let me unpack that. Regulatory, this is how the Democrats have really stifled energy, and they've put a lot of regulations on top of it. I wouldn't say it's just energy. You could say that the same about financial services and a lot of other industries, but it tends to be heavier regulation from the Democrats, less heavy regulation. I wouldn't say the differences beyond that are that different. Uncertainty I bring to suggest, energy is sort of lifeblood of the global economy, and I think Democrats struggle with the all of the above concept. And so I think Republicans will embrace that a little more overtly, saying, hey, all of the above is necessary. The only thing I would point out that I think it's really important for people to keep in mind is, like, production of oil here in the U.S. is a terrible way to try and gauge it. You just look back to 2023. President Biden obviously in office right now, a Democratic administration, and oil production in the U.S. grows by 1 million barrels a day, or 8%. One of the bigger years of growth we've seen in the last 5 or so. So the reality is we're seeing production growth. The uncertainty, if you say, during the election is going to be around how is regulatory policy more restrictive, less restrictive.
Well, let's get into that then, because one of the interesting things is when you look at either candidate, there are potential roadblocks for anybody who sits in the White House. Right now, our base case here in CIO is a divided Congress. So there's that to contend with as well, if it goes the way we think it will. Still many, many months to go, right? But what are some of the bigger regulatory policies, Jay, that you see that maybe could differentiate between Biden and Trump?
I think what you'll hear them talk a lot about is 2 of them. First, the Inflation Reduction Act. That's legislation, but there's regulatory elements of it. And there'll be, a lot of talk about that, the very clean focus, EVs, et cetera. I think the other one will be, and it will be not as overt, but environmental policy, where, again, Republicans tend to take a softer hand there, and Democrats a sort of harder or more aggressive hand in regulation. Now, what I would point out again here is, I think the energy industry, by and large, has embraced a lot of these environmental regulations, methane emission controls and the like. Even if the Republicans were to eliminate those, I would imagine those would actually go forward, and the industry would continue to adopt those and continue to control methane emissions. So it's not to say that if you get Republicans in office, you're going to have, unmitigated, environmental sort of stresses. It's just the way they're going to approach it and the words they'll use that, ultimately will differentiate the candidates, again, on that regulatory side of things.
Do you think then, though, that if say Trump gets reelected, do you think he'll try to get rid of some of those regulatory roadblocks, and do you think he would even be successful?
Yeah, I think he may talk about it. When we talk about, say, the Inflation Reduction Act, for example, wind and solar and battery subsidies, a lot of these have gone to very red states like Texas and others. So I'm not sure you'd get undoing. Remember, all politics are local, so somebody voting in Congress, which is where legislation would have to be voted on and passed, would have to be saying, no, I don't want any more of this in my state. I want something else. And I think that's probably a long putt. Where I would sort of caveat that is if you had a red sweep, so that you had, every branch, or sorry, both chambers of Congress Republican and the White House Republican, there may be a desire to just sort of vindictively tear down some of the IRA legislatively, just to say because we can. That seems to me to be a low probability, at least where we sit right now. So I would say generally, there'll be some talk, but I would say the odds would be pretty slim.
Jay, thank you. And something else I wanted to bring up with you is that in 2023, the Pew Research Center did a survey of Americans asking them about their thoughts essentially on renewables and fossil fuels, et cetera. 67% of those surveyed did say that they thought that moving to renewables, like wind and solar, et cetera, are really important to do. But in that survey, 31% of those people said, well, I'm not quite ready to give up my fossil fuels just yet. So it really does prove the point that people understand that there is that all of the above approach when it comes to energy.
I think the all of the above approach is sort of better framed as reliability, affordability, and decarbonization. I think that Pew Research, I would bet, or at least hypothesize, that when those people were initially answering the question, they assumed, as a lot of people did prior to 2022, they assumed reliable and low-cost energy. And if that continues, yeah, I'm very much in favor of renewables. I think where the tension comes in, and we saw this in Europe on the heels of Russia's invasion of the Ukraine, is when power or energy gets expensive or unreliable, we tend to see decarbonization sort of fall as a priority for people. And that makes sense when you think about it. What I've often highlighted is, God forbid, if we make it unreliable and unaffordable, then again, we see where, coal and other, very, very nasty use energy tends to find its way to the top of the pecking order again.
And quickly, Jay, just given that all of the above approach again, what would you maybe expect from legislation? Obviously, there's no magical crystal ball here, but just given what what legislation might you expect in the next term of whoever the president might be?
I think both parties understand that permitting legislation is really one. If you look at the sort of underbelly of this, energy transition, what we really need is more infrastructure, electric transmission lines, pipelines. I know they're not popular, but gas pipelines and the like, which hopefully could also move hydrogen. But we need this infrastructure because in many cases, energy is not where we need it, it's where we produce it, and the load centers are far away. It takes, 6 to 8 years on average, and sometimes a lot longer, to site these resources, and we need permitting. I mean, we're gonna miss on decarbonization if we don't fix this. So I do think there's a recognition. Obviously, we all know politics is fairly divided right now. So is it likely? I'm not sure, but certainly I think parties understand that needs to be passed legislatively.
Absolutely. And again, as I said, we will certainly hear about it on the debates and on the campaign trail. So good to have it from you first, though, Jay. Good to see you.
Thanks, Anthony.
Thanks very much, Jay Dobson from the Chief Investment Office. And thank you all for joining us. For more on everything election related, please visit our website, ubs.com/election watch. You'll find all the other episodes in this series there, plus tons of other election content coming from our Chief Investment Office. And we would encourage you to continue this conversation. Make sure you're reaching out to your financial advisor. Until next time, I'm Anthony Pastore. We hope you have a great day, everybody. See you soon.